Organizations in Ghana, such as the National Peace Council, the National Commission on Civic Education, the Electoral Commission, and the Ghana Police Service play critical roles in Ghana's elections. And the National Peace Council and the National Commission on Civic Education are two uniquely Ghanaian institutions that could and should be copied around the world. Their efforts ensure that the voice of the Ghanaian people is not only heard, but also respected and acted upon. However, as the previous speakers have outlined, we find ourselves at a moment in which democracy strength is being tested around the world, and especially here in West Africa. In recent years, some parts of West Africa have witnessed a distressing decline in democratic norms and a weakening of democratic institutions. This has been characterized by a resurgence of authoritarian regimes, a rise in violent extremism, pervasive corruption, alarming human rights abuses, discrimination against minorities, restrictions on press freedom and free speech, and a failure to share economic prosperity equitably. These factors not only undermine the fabric of democracy, but also erode trust in the very institutions meant to safeguard it and protect human rights. Those countries that stepped away from democracy are now even less secure than they were before their democratically elected governments were replaced by military juntas. On multiple occasions, we've seen rampant and state-sponsored disinformation used to manufacture narratives and spread false information that undermines elected government. That's not to say that these West African governments were perfect. They weren't. And I think something that's very important to discuss today is the need for consistency in calling out attacks on democracy, not just by soldiers, but by all kinds of people, and by disinformation, and by corruption and discrimination. But the massive onslaught of disinformation has undermined democratically elected governments' mandates and accelerated their downfall and made life for the citizens of those countries more complicated, not less complicated. A study by the African Center for Strategic Studies released earlier this month found that disinformation campaigns in Africa have surged nearly fourfold just since 2022. They have 189 documented disinformation campaigns in Africa, 19 in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger alone. Make no mistake, disinformation is not the only reason for the decline of democracy in West Africa. It's also about the inability of elected governments to deliver on their promises, share economic prosperity, fight corruption, uphold the rule of law, bolster democratic institutions, improve security, and deliver for their people. And I used to think there was a continuum between security and democracy, or security and liberty. And I've come to realize that it's not nearly that simple. I used to think that mothers and fathers would take choices to surrender some of their liberty in order to protect their children, so that their daughters didn't get raped when they stepped outside the gate. But again, it's not that simple. Discrimination against minorities causes grievance, which then make those groups vulnerable to recruitment by violent extremists, for example, which then create a downward spiral for security. Corruption also undermines the institutions that protect security, and again, creates a violent often, but vicious downward spiral. When a democratic government fails to live up to expectations, the solution is actually more democracy, not less. That's important to remind people. Millions of people around the world living under less free regimes still clamor for democracy every day. And as we've seen around the world, democracy can be fragile. It needs to be protected, and it needs to deliver for those people.